4. Jesus even goes so far as to set his teaching over against that of the Torah. The criticism which is implied in the antitheses to the Torah would be, in the eyes of his contemporaries, blasphemy against the divine law, and as such the decisive break with Jewish piety. It is not, therefore, so simple a matter to set the Sermon on the Mount in the context of late Judaism. Now, naturally, Windisch is conscious of this, and therefore he says, what we find in the Matthean composition as a whole, as well as in the separate sayings, is not simply the ethic of late Judaism, but a refined, humanized, radicalized, simplified, concentrated Judaism that finds its fulfillment in the confession to Jesus. We could continue to suggest similar modifying adjectives, but this would not bring us to the heart of the matter with regard to the Sermon on the Mount. The fact is that Jesus was not a teacher of the law or a preacher of wisdom, such as could be found among his contemporaries. His message burst the bounds of late Judaism. We now turn to a second answer to the question of the meaning of the theory of the Sermon on the Mount. It is the answer that has been given by Lutheran Orthodoxy, the theory of the impossible ideal. This has not only played a great part in the past centuries, even today it has numerous supporters. With this conception of the meaning of the sermon, we move out of the superficiality of the theory which we discussed first and into deeper realms. The second conception says, when we read the Sermon on the Mount earnestly, we are of necessity moved to despair. Jesus demands that we should free ourselves from anger. Even an unfriendly word is to be reckoned as murder. Jesus demands a chastity that extends even to the avoidance of an impure look. Jesus demands absolute veracity, and that we should love our enemies. Who lives like this? Who can live like this? Who can fulfill these demands? This is the point of departure for the theory of the impossible ideal. It says, it is a great mistake to regard the Sermon on the Mount as capable of being fulfilled. These teachings of Jesus cannot be fulfilled, and Jesus knows this. What is then his intention in teaching these things? The answer of the theory of the impossible ideal is, that can best be understood when these demands are viewed through eyes that have been sharpened by what Paul has to say about the law. The law, says Paul, has not been given that it may lead to life. It is not law which saves, but faith. Law awakens the consciousness of sin. Law provokes transgression. The law is preparatio evangelica, in that it reveals to man his impotence. By driving him to despair, it opens his eyes to the wonder of the mercy of God. It is exactly the same with the Sermon on the Mount, and this was the intention of Jesus. He wanted to bring his listeners to the consciousness that they cannot, in their own strength, fulfill the demands of God. He intends to lead men through the experience of their failure to despair of themselves. His demands are designed to shatter our self-reliance. Nothing else is intended. The Sermon on the Mount, according to the second theory, is Mosissimus Moses, to take a phrase from Luther. It is Moses quadrupled, Moses multiplied to the highest degree. If the first conception sees in the Sermon on the Mount a perfectionist law, the second discovers in it a pedagogical law, a law the purpose of which is to prepare men for salvation. Again, in my opinion, we must say emphatically that here there is a real element of validity. On the one hand, it is a valid emphasis that the demands of Jesus are to be taken seriously and may not be trifled with. On the other hand, our poverty is also taken seriously. But what does the actual text of the sermon say? Where in the sermon does one find even a hint upon which such an interpretation could be based? Certainly there are some sayings which seem to bear the stamp of the impossibility of fulfillment. For example, Matthew 5:29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. But one cannot build a theory on sayings such as these, for this is a paradoxical exaggeration such as we often find in Eastern sayings, such as a saying like that of the mote and the beam in Matthew 7:4 and 5 is a paradoxical picture language. Such language does not justify the conclusion that Jesus was deliberately stating an impossible ideal. Nowhere in the Sermon on the Mount is there a clear statement which points unmistakably in this direction, and upon which such a theory could be built. Nowhere is there to be found, as there is in Paul, reflection upon the inability of men to fulfill the will of God, but rather the astonishing fact that Jesus expected from his disciples that they would do what he commanded. He addresses himself to the will of men. The conclusion of the sermon shows this especially clearly. The four groups of pictures of the narrow and wide gate, of the sound and bad trees, of the men standing before the throne of God at the final judgment, and of the building of the house on rock and sand. Chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. When the waves of the last judgment beat upon the rock, then the man will stand firm who, quote, hears these words of mine and does them, end quote. And only he. The instructions of the sermon apply to everyone who is a disciple of Jesus. They direct his way to the narrow gate, to the reign of God. So we must reject also the theory of the impossible ideal. It is in fact a classic example of what the consequences are when one interprets Jesus in the light of Paul, instead of interpreting Paul in the light of Jesus. In its Paulinizing exegesis, and that means it is eisegesis. Finally, there is a third understanding of the sermon that deserves mention, that which understands it as a interim ethic. This interpretation was first developed at the end of the last century by Johannes Weiss in his book Die Predigt von Reiche Gottes, 1892. And it is also to be found in the works of Albert Schweitzer. Both of these authors wrote in the era of belief in progress and of cultural Protestantism, when the preaching of Jesus was viewed as a culture ethic. Against this background, they developed their eschatological interpretation of the gospel. They claim that Jesus does not preach a long-term culture ethic, but rather his demands are rooted in the terrible earnestness of the hour. The supreme crisis is at hand. The time of decision has come. God has given man a last opportunity for repentance and decision before the waves of the flood break once more into history, before the judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah is repeated. And the main source for this new and radically eschatological view of the preaching of Jesus is the Sermon on the Mount. For the sermon contains, according to the tenets of thoroughgoing eschatology, exceptional laws valid only for the time of crisis. It is, so to speak, a form of martial law, declared in the last decisive phase of a total war. The sermon was preached to men who knew that they were standing under a dangerously leaning wall which might at any time come tumbling down upon them. To men who found themselves in the position of a dying man who knows that he had only a very little time left. This means, in the words of the Sermon on the Mount, are a challenge to most exceptional effort in the face of catastrophe, a last call to repentance before the end.